Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, our focus is, well, absolutely huge. We're digging into the sources on the French Revolution, an event that wasn't just a turning point for France, it fundamentally rewrote the rules for the entire Western world.
That's really the core of it, isn't it? We're looking at how a society based completely on who your parents were transformed.
Yeah.
I mean, it was violent, chaotic, sure, but it's where these modern ideas of liberty, freedom, equality really start getting hammered out. We kind of take them for granted now, but they have this intense, complex history we need to unpack.
Okay, so let's get into that unpacking. The picture we get from the sources leading up to 1789 is a society just simmering, ready to boil over. It seems like it wasn't just poverty, but this collision course between the state being broke and this massive unfairness in society.
That collision is key, yeah. When Louis XVI came to the throne, was it 1774? The treasury was basically empty, decades of wars, and then crucially, the massive cost of backing the American colonies against Britain. That alone added, what, over $1 billion livres to the debt? And the debt was already enormous, maybe over $2 billion. Lenders were getting nervous, demanding like 10% interest.
Wow, so a huge chunk of the state's money was just going to pay interest on loans.
Exactly. Just servicing the debt. It was unsustainable.
So here's the obvious question. If the king needed cash so badly, why couldn't he just tax the rich, the nobles, the clergy?
Correct.
Was the system really that locked down?
It was locked down by design. You had this society of estates, the old regime, the first estate, the clergy, and the second, the nobility. They had privileges just because of who they were. And the big one, exemption from taxes.
They just didn't have to pay?
Nope. And they had enough political clout to block any serious reform attempts.
Right, so the entire financial weight lands on the third estate, and that's basically everyone else.
Pretty much. About 90% were peasants, but it also included merchants, lawyers, bankers, artisans, you name it. Wealthy or poor, if you weren't clergy or nobility, you were in the third estate. And they paid everything. The main state tax, the taille, various indirect taxes on goods like salt, and the church tax, the tithes.
It sounds completely unbalanced, especially when you factor in population growth. The sources mention a jump, right, from maybe 23 million to 28 million people.
Yeah, in less than a century. More mouths to feed means demand for grain, especially bread, just skyrockets. But farming techniques hadn't really kept up. Production couldn't match the demand.
So the price of bread, the absolute basic food for most people, starts climbing rapidly.
Dramatically. While wages for workers stayed pretty much flat. So that gap between rich and poor, it wasn't just numbers on a page, it was felt viscerally, daily.
That sounds like more than just hard times.
It was what the sources call a subsistence crisis. Your basic ability to survive is genuinely threatened. This happened repeatedly under the old regime, but by the late 1780s, it was hitting really hard. It creates desperation.
So the king thinks, okay, I need money, let's try new taxes, but he's actually just lighting a match near a powder keg. And then comes the summer of 1789. Paris is apparently buzzing with rumors, paranoia about troops moving in.
Yeah, total alarm. People thought the king was going to crack down. So on July 14th, ordinary citizens decide to arm themselves. They form a sort of people's militia, and they target the Bastille.
That huge fortress prison, a real symbol of the king's power, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It represented arbitrary royal authority. They went there looking for ammunition they believed was stored inside.
And there's that amazing detail in the research. After all the fighting the commander killed, the symbol of tyranny falls, and they only find 7 prisoners inside.
Isn't that something? It shows it wasn't really about freeing prisoners. It was about tearing down the symbol. The physical building held few, but the idea of the Bastille was immense. They literally demolished it afterwards, sold the stones as souvenirs. People were furious, yes, about bread prices, but this time was different.
How so?
Because you had this rising, educated, middle-class part of that third estate who were ready with ideas for a whole new system.
Ah, right. The lawyers, merchants, officials, they had money, education, but no real political power under the old rules. They're the ones pushing the idea that your place in society should be about merit, not just birth, right?
Exactly. And they were soaking up Enlightenment philosophy. Reading John Locke, who's basically dismantled the idea of the divine right of kings. Reading Rousseau, with his concept of the social contract, that government should be based on an agreement between the people and their representatives.
And Montesquieu, too, I suppose. With the separation of powers idea, legislative, executive, judicial, like what the Americans were trying.
Precisely. And these weren't just academic debates. These ideas were discussed everywhere, salons, coffee houses. They were even read aloud in public squares for people who couldn't read.
So the ideas were out there, spreading, the social pressure was intense, the government was broke.
The stage was perfectly set for something dramatic.
And the king himself provides the trigger, ironically. He needs those new taxes approved. But he can't just decree it. So he has to call the Estates General, this old assembly that hadn't met since, 1614? He calls them for May 1789.
And that meeting immediately becomes the flashpoint. You have the first and second estates with 300 representatives each. The third estate gets 600, but they're made to stand at the back. And crucially, the old voting system was 1 vote per estate.
Which means the 2 privileged estates could always outvote the third estate 2-1, even though the third represented almost everyone.
Exactly. So the third estate makes this radical demand. Voting should be by head, 1 member, 1 vote. A democratic principle straight from Rousseau.
Which the king obviously rejects.
He does. And that's the moment. The third estate representatives declare themselves the National Assembly, the true representatives of the nation. They walk out.
And end up in that indoor tennis court swearing the famous oath. June 20th, 1789. They vow to stay together until they've written a constitution limiting the king's power. While this is happening in Versailles, what's going on in the rest of France, the sources talk about the great fear.
Right, panic sweeps the countryside. Rumors fly that landowners have hired thugs to destroy crops. So peasants fight back. They attack the nobles' castles, the chateau, they seize grain stores, and maybe most importantly, they burn the documents listing all their feudal dues and obligations.
Destroying the records of their debt, essentially.
Yes. This combined pressure from Paris and the countryside forces Louis XVI's hand. He has to officially recognize the National Assembly.
And that recognition opens the door for huge changes. The Assembly acts fast, right? August 4th, 1789.
A massive night. They vote to abolish the entire feudal system. No more special privileges, no more feudal dues. The church tithes are gone. Church lands are confiscated. That confiscation alone brought in assets worth maybe 2 billion livres for the state.
And then comes the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Foundational stuff.
Absolutely foundational. It lays out these natural and inalienable rights. Liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression, equality before the law. And critically, it states that sovereignty rests with the nation, not the king.
And this seems like a recurring theme, there's an immediate catch, isn't there, in the Constitution that follows in 1791?
There is. A huge contradiction. The Declaration proclaims universal rights, but the Constitution divides citizens. Only active citizens, men over 25, who paid a certain amount in taxes. Basically, the propertied class got the vote. Everyone else, including all women, were deemed passive citizens.
So rights for all, but political power only for some. That seems guaranteed to cause more trouble.
And it did. It directly fueled the next, more radical phase. Many felt the revolution hadn't delivered true equality. This is where political clubs become really important, especially the Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre.
Who are the Jacobins drawing support from?
Mostly the less prosperous city dwellers, artisans, shopkeepers, servants, people who felt left out by the 1791 Constitution. They became known as the sans-culottes. Literally without knee breeches, because they wore the long trousers of working men, not the fancy knee breeches of the aristocracy.
Their influence grows, and things get more violent.
Much more. August 1792, there's a major insurrection in Paris, fueled by war setbacks and suspicion of the king. They storm the Tuileries Palace, the king is imprisoned, new elections are called, and this time, crucially, all adult men get the vote, regardless of wealth. A big shift. This new body, the convention, meets in September 1792, immediately abolishes the monarchy, declares France a republic.
And the king's fate.
Louis XVI is tried for treason by the convention, found guilty, executed by guillotine in January 1793. Marie Antoinette follows him later that year.
This marks the beginning of the most notorious phase, doesn't it? The Reign of Terror.
Yes, roughly 1793 to 1794, under the effective dictatorship of Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. It's a period of intense control. Robespierre saw terror as necessary to protect the revolution from enemies, both internal and external. Anyone deemed counter-revolutionary nobles, clergy, political opponents, even fellow revolutionaries who disagreed with him could be arrested, tried quickly, and guillotined. Thousands were executed.
The sources mention some really specific, almost bizarre controls, too, like setting maximum prices and wages.
Yeah, rationing meat and bread, even forcing everyone to eat the same type of bread.
Equality
bread. And language was controlled, too. No more monsieur or madame. Everyone was citoyen or citoyenne. It was an attempt at total social leveling, enforced by fear.
It sounds utterly ruthless. How did it end?
Robespierre basically went too far. He became increasingly paranoid, purging even allies. Eventually, his opponents in the convention felt they might be next. In July 1794, they turned on him. He was arrested and, well, met the same fate as his victims, the guillotine.
And his fall leads to another swing of the pendulum.
Exactly. The wealthier middle class, the ones who'd benefited from the early revolution but were suppressed by the Jacobins, they regained control. They set up a new government called the Directory, 5 executives, meant to prevent one person getting too much power. But they also write another constitution, rolling back voting rights again, excluding the non-propertied.
So, back to rule by the wealthy.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the Directory itself was incredibly unstable, constant infighting, political paralysis. It created a power vacuum.
A vacuum perfectly filled by...
A rising military star named Napoleon Bonaparte. The Directory's weakness paved the way for his coup and eventually him crowning himself emperor in 1804.
It's just this relentless cycle of upheaval. Monarchy, republic, terror, oligarchy, emperor. But amidst all that political chaos, there were lasting social shifts happening, right? What about women?
Women were incredibly active throughout. They formed political clubs. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women is maybe the most famous. They wrote pamphlets, petitioned, demanded rights. Remember, they were classified as passive citizens in 1791, denied the vote. They fought hard against that.
Did they achieve anything concrete?
There were some early gains under the revolutionary governments. Things like compulsory schooling for girls, divorce being legalized, more access to job training. Important steps. But their demands for full political equality were fiercely resisted, especially during the Terror when women's clubs were shut down. And we have to remember Olympe de Gouges. She wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women, directly challenging the male-only version. The Jacobins executed her for it in 1793.
Just tragic. And French women didn't get the vote until...
1946. A very long struggle.
What about slavery? That was a huge issue for France's colonies.
Absolutely. The wealth of colonies like Martinique and Saint-Domingue depended on the brutal triangular slave trade. Sugar, coffee, indigo, all produced by enslaved Africans. The Radical Convention government did abolish slavery throughout the French colonies in 1794, a truly revolutionary moment.
But it didn't last.
No. 10 years later, Napoleon, under pressure from planter interests and needing colonial revenue, controversially brought it back. Slavery wasn't finally and permanently abolished in the French colonies until 1848, another long, drawn-out fight.
So, despite the violence, the reversals, what would you say is the single most important legacy that endured?
It's hard to pick just one, but maybe the idea of freedom of expression becoming normalized. After the Bastille fell, censorship collapsed for a time. Suddenly you had this explosion of newspapers, pamphlets, cartoons, plays, songs. Ideas about liberty, justice, equality, and fierce debates about those ideas could circulate much more freely than ever before. It changed the whole public sphere.
And these ideas didn't just stay in France.
Not at all. They spread across Europe and beyond. The ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, and democratic rights became incredibly influential. They inspired liberal movements everywhere, and later, anti-colonial movements. The sources mention figures like Tipu Sultan and Ramohan Roy in India, looking at France and drawing inspiration.
When you step back, though, it's such a contradictory story. The birth of modern rights alongside the reign of terror.
That's the paradox, isn't it? The modern world inherits both. The push for democracy and rights, but also the demonstration of how revolutionary fervor can descend into tyranny and violence. But the framework, the language we still use today to talk about rights and citizenship, so much of it was forged in that incredibly chaotic decade.
It really is amazing, that core idea that power, sovereignty comes from the nation, not from a hereditary king, that truly changed everything. It's the bedrock of the modern state, really. Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. We saw how the 1791 Constitution gave voting rights only to men with property, and how the Directory later did the same thing, this back and forth over who gets to be an active citizen, who really counts. What does that tell us about how difficult, how contested the path to achieving real universal equality actually is? Something to think about.